They buried her mother's genius, humiliated her in 3 financial publications, froze her equity with a legal injunction, exposed her husband's secret about the bus stop, and unleashed a conspiracy 15 years in the making. And every single one of these weapons was fired at Vivienne Hartford by a man who had been eating dinner at her table, calling her husband by his first name, and smiling at her across boardroom tables while maintaining the most sophisticated betrayal in the entire history of Weston and Crane Real Estate. Because those wounds were inflicted by enemies, and enemies Vivienne had learned were survivable. But Gordon Hale was not an enemy. He was a trusted friend. Go back with me. Not to the church, not to the boardroom, not to the Meridian Grand Hotel. And go back further than all of it, to the very beginning of this story, before Vivienne was born, before Elliot was born, before a single floor of Weston and Crane Real Estate had been built, or a single contract signed. Go back to a woman named Margaret Hartford, who grew dahlias in window boxes and believed that beauty was an act of resistance, sitting across a table from 2 men with a blueprint in her hands. Not their blueprint, hers, the original vision, the original concept, the architectural genius of an entire real estate empire that would one day be worth $4.7 trillion, drawn, designed, and delivered by a woman who would receive none of the credit, none of the equity, and none of the legacy. Because the 2 men sitting across that table, one of them Elliot's father, and one of them a man named Gordon Hale, had already decided before Margaret arrived what they were going to do with her idea and what they were going to do about her. But here is what part 2 did not tell you. Gordon Hale did not simply execute the burial of Margaret Hartford's stake as Elliot's father's legal instrument. Gordon Hale was a 3rd founding partner, a secret one, whose entire stake in Weston and Crane Real Estate was built on the foundation of Margaret's buried genius. If Margaret's intellectual authorship of the company concept was ever legally proven and restored, Gordon's stake evaporated entirely. He had nothing. He had never had anything. And for 15 years, through Elliot's accident, through Elliot's deliberate invisibility, through the bus stop and the wedding and the boardroom and the counselor's card and the shareholder meeting, Gordon Hale had been sitting inside Elliot's innermost circle, wearing the face of a trusted friend, protecting the lie that kept him wealthy at the cost of a dead woman's legacy and her daughter's inheritance. There is a thing that happens when a man has been protecting a lie for 15 years. He becomes very, very good at recognizing when the lie is about to surface. And Gordon recognized it the morning Vivienne's lawyer stood up in that shareholder meeting and claimed Margaret Hartford's 20% stake. He recognized it and he moved faster, harder, and more viciously than Alexandra or Derek had ever moved. Because Gordon Hale was not a wounded man acting from pride or a calculating woman acting from ambition. He was a cornered man acting from survival. And cornered men with 15 years of access to a company's most sensitive legal infrastructure are the most dangerous opponents Vivienne Hartford had ever faced. He went to the press first. 3 financial publications, simultaneous, coordinated, funded. A manufactured story that made Vivienne the villain, a gold digger, a manipulator, a woman who had researched Elliot's identity and targeted him deliberately and married him not for love, but for access to the company her mother had been cut out of. Her face on 3 front pages above words that made her stomach turn. And then the legal injunction, filed the same morning the story broke, freezing her newly transferred equity stake pending investigation into what Gordon was calling fraudulent acquisition of company interest. But Gordon was not finished, because Gordon had a partner the viewer thought was gone. Alexandra Voss, settled, ended, finished, had never been finished at all. She had been waiting, because Gordon had been her source from the very beginning. The person who told her about the buried document, the person who designed her legal strategy, the person who pointed her toward Derek as a useful instrument of chaos. Alexandra was never the architect. She was always Gordon's front, and now with Vivienne publicly humiliated and legally frozen, and the press storm breaking across every financial publication in the country, Gordon and Alexandra moved together toward the endgame that Gordon had been 15 years in the planning, but they had made the same mistake that everyone in this story had made. They had underestimated what was growing quietly in the places they were not watching. So ask yourself this. When Elliot sits Vivienne down in the middle of the worst storm of her life and tells her the truth about the bus stop on Meridian Street, what does she do? When Camille discovers the full extent of Gordon's conspiracy and understands exactly what exposing it will cost her, which way does she turn? And when the second sealed document surfaces, the one that proves Margaret Hartford's intellectual authorship of the entire company, what happens to every single person who built their wealth, their power, and their identity on the burial of one woman's genius? What they did will devastate you. What Vivienne does will restore you. And what her mother left behind will change everything you thought you knew about this story from the very beginning. Dear viewers, Part 3 of this story will teach you the most powerful lesson of the entire trilogy, that the people who bury the truth are never bearing it from you. They are bearing it from themselves. And that the most extraordinary lives are not the ones that avoided every storm. They are the ones that were built, carefully and honestly and with great love, from everything the storm left behind. Watch until the very last word. Then drop in the comments the moment that broke you open. And tell me, when Elliot told Vivienne the truth about the bus stop, what would you have done? Subscribe now. The best story is always the next one. The morning the story broke, Vivienne was making tea. Not because she had seen the publications yet, not because she knew what Gordon had done, or what Alexandra had set in motion, or what 3 front pages were saying about her face above words she had not yet read. But because it was 7:45 in the morning, and making tea was what she did at 7:45, the same way she opened the 4th leather notebook, and the same way she tended the dahlias, and the same way she moved through the ordinary infrastructure of a life that had been assembled, carefully and without performance, from the wreckage of things that had tried to unmake her. Elliot's phone rang first. She heard it from the kitchen, the specific ring he reserved for his legal team, 2 short bursts that meant something required immediate attention, and she heard his voice drop into the register it used when the news was significant, and he was processing it before he brought it to her. She had learned that register. She had learned all of his registers the way you learn a language you intend to speak for the rest of your life. Not from a textbook, but from immersion, from daily use, from the 10,000 small moments of paying attention that constitute a real marriage. She was still holding the kettle when he came to the kitchen doorway. His expression was not the weather she could read. It was something she had not seen before. A combination of fury and guilt, and the specific helplessness of a man who has been trying to prevent something and has just learned that he was 3 hours too late. He held his phone out to her without speaking, and Vivienne set the kettle down and took the phone and read. Her own face looked back at her from 3 different front pages. The photographs were not unflattering. Gordon had been too intelligent for that, understanding that an unflattering photograph invites sympathy, and he needed the public to see a composed, deliberate woman, not a wounded one. The headlines were precise and surgical and designed by someone who understood exactly how much damage could be done with carefully selected true details arranged around a completely false conclusion. Hartford Crane, the calculated marriage behind the $1 trillion claim, how Vivienne Hartford researched, targeted, and married her way into Weston Crane Real Estate, the woman behind the equity claim, and the questions her husband hasn't asked. Vivienne read all 3 articles completely. She did not skim. She did not stop halfway through when the words became too precise in their wrongness. She read every sentence the way she had always read difficult things, with the full, unflinching attention of a woman who understood that you could not respond to something you had not fully understood, and that understanding something fully was not the same as being destroyed by it. When she finished, she handed the phone back to Elliot, and she stood at the kitchen counter for a long moment, her hands flat on the surface, looking at the dahlias on the windowsill. Deep burgundy, or the color of something that had decided to be beautiful despite everything. And she did what she had always done in the moments when the world became loudest. She went quiet inside it. "Gordon," she said. It was not a question. Elliot's jaw tightened. His legal team filed the injunction 40 minutes ago. The publications went live at 6. He coordinated them. A pause. He has been coordinating this since the shareholder meeting, possibly longer. Vivienne turned to look at him. How much longer? The question carried more weight than its 4 words suggested, and Elliot heard all of it. He heard the full history compressed inside it, the dinner parties, the bread passed across the table, the boardroom smiles, and the 15 years of proximity and trust and access that Gordon Hale had spent not in service of the company or of Elliot, but in service of the lie that had made both of them possible for him. Since the beginning, Elliot said, and then he told her about Gordon Hale's founding stake, about the third partner, about the contingency that made Margaret Hartford's burial not just convenient for Gordon, but existential. The specific, catastrophic mathematics of a man whose entire wealth and identity and professional existence depended on a dead woman's genius remaining unacknowledged and her daughter remaining unaware. Vivienne listened without interrupting. She listened the way she always listened, with complete attention and without the performance of reaction, processing everything in the deep, an unhurried place where she kept the things that mattered most. And when Elliot finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Long enough for the morning light to shift across the kitchen floor, long enough for the dahlias to catch it, long enough for the full weight of what she had just been told to settle into its proper place inside her. "My mother knew," she said. Not a question, not an accusation, a recognition. The specific, sorrowful recognition of a daughter who has just understood in a new and devastating way the full dimensions of a sacrifice that was made for her before she was old enough to know a sacrifice was being made. Elliot nodded slowly. "We think so." "Yes." Vivienne looked at the dahlias for a long time. Then she straightened. She picked up the kettle. She finished making the tea. And she set Elliot's cup in front of him with the steady hands of a woman who had decided, in the quiet of her own interior, that Gordon Hale had made the same fatal error that every person in this story had made before him. He had confused her stillness for passivity, her grace for weakness, her quiet for the absence of power. But Vivienne Hartford's quiet had never been the absence of power. It had always been the place where she kept it. But what Vivienne did not yet know, what was sitting in a sealed envelope inside the company's deepest legal archive, waiting to be found by the one person in the building with both the access and the reason to look, was the second sealed document, the one older and deeper than the first, the one that did not just restore Margaret Hartford's equity, the one that proved, in Margaret's own handwriting, that the entire conceptual foundation of Weston Crane Real Estate had been hers from the very first line, and the person about to find it was the last person Gordon Hale had thought to watch. Camille Rhodes had been assigned to the internal audit of the company's founding-era documentation 3 weeks earlier, not by Gordon, who would never have assigned her anything that brought her within proximity of the archive, but by the newly restructured compliance committee that Vivienne's equity transfer had made possible, and that Gordon, in the complexity of managing his press strategy and his legal injunction and his Alexandra correspondence, had failed to monitor with his usual precision. It was the first mistake he had made in 15 years. Camille had not been looking for anything specific when she found the first payment record. She had been doing exactly what her reinstated role required: methodical, unglamorous, line-by-line audit work that most people in the company would have delegated to a junior analyst without a second thought. But Camille Rhodes was not most people in the company anymore. She was a woman who had learned, at significant cost, that the details you overlooked were always the ones that mattered most. So she did not delegate. She sat at her desk in the early mornings before the office filled, and she went through the founding-era files with the specific, unhurried attention of someone who had decided that doing her job completely was its own form of integrity. The first payment record appeared in a file labeled Administrative Overhead, Quarterly Disbursements, Founding Period. It was a single line item, a number significant enough to notice, but not significant enough to flag immediately. What made Camille pause was not the amount, but the recipient designation, a private account coded with a reference number she did not recognize, disbursed quarterly, without interruption for 15 years, authorized each time by the same digital signature. G. Hale. She sat with that for a moment. Then she pulled the next quarter. The same line item, the same account, the same signature. She pulled every quarter for 15 years and laid them side by side on her screen and looked at what 15 years of quarterly payments to an undesignated private account authorized consistently by the company's chief legal officer, looked like when you removed them from the context of individual filing periods and saw them as a single unbroken pattern. And it looked like maintenance, the specific, regular, expensive maintenance of something that needed to be kept in place. Camille opened a new search window. She typed the private account reference number into the company's legal archive database, a database she had access to as part of the audit scope. A database Gordon had not thought to restrict because restricting it would have required explaining why, and what came back made her sit very still in the early morning quiet of her reinstated office for a long time. The account was linked to a sealed legal file. Reference number GH-MH-001. Created 15 years ago. Authorized by G. Hale. Password protected. But the password protection, she discovered after 40 minutes of careful navigation through the archive's administrative backend, had been set up using the same system that had since been updated twice, and the original password architecture was still accessible to anyone with full audit clearance. Camille had full audit clearance. She opened the file. What she found inside was not one document, it was a collection, 15 years of correspondence, payment authorizations, legal memos, and at the very bottom, below everything else, 2 items that made her breath leave her body completely. The first was the original sealed addendum, the one that had already been found, already been presented, already been used to restore Margaret Hartford's 20% equity stake. But beneath it, separated by a single sheet of plain paper, was something older, something that predated the addendum by 3 years. A document written not in legal language, but in the plain, clear, it's deliberate handwriting of a woman who had understood exactly what she was creating and had wanted the record to be unmistakable. It was Margaret Hartford's original blueprint, 12 pages, handwritten, dated, signed, and annotated in the margins, with the specific notations of someone who had been developing this concept for months before she brought it to the table. The concept for what would become Weston Crane Real Estate, the founding vision, the architectural framework, the investment model, the geographic strategy, in the handwriting of a woman who had grown dahlias in window boxes and believed that beauty was an act of resistance, and had walked into a room with 2 men and placed her genius on the table between them and never walked back out with it. At the bottom of the 12th page, in different ink, added later, Camille could see in the hand of someone who had read the document after it was written, was a single annotation. This is hers, all of it. R.C.R.C. Camille stared at those initials for a long time. Then she opened the company's founding partnership records and searched the original signatories until she found the name that matched. Robert Crane, Elliot's father. Elliot's father had read Margaret's blueprint, had written those 4 words in the margin, had known completely, unambiguously in his own hand that everything they were about to build was hers, and had buried it anyway. Not out of malice, the counselor had taught Camille to consider, but out of the specific catastrophic paternalism of a man who had made a decision that was not his to make, and had spent the rest of his life, apparently, unable to fully live with it, because why else would he have compiled the file, written the list, sent his son to the address on Meridian Street, if not because the weight of what he had done had never, in 30 years, fully left him. Camille sat in her office until the building began to fill around her. She sat with the blueprint on her screen and the payment records beside it and the GH-MH-00, one file open in a third window, and she understood, with the complete and devastating clarity of a woman whose eyes had been opened by everything she had already survived and caused, exactly what she was holding. She also understood exactly what presenting it would cost her. Gordon would move against her reinstatement within hours of her filing. His internal influence, still significant despite the shareholder meeting, why he's still embedded in the company's operational structure in ways that the compliance committee had not yet fully mapped, would be deployed against her with the efficiency of a man who had been neutralizing threats inside this building for 15 years. She would lose her job, her rebuilt reputation, the handwritten note from Elliot that she kept beside the counselor's card, the slow, unglamorous, precious reconstruction of a person she was actually proud to be becoming. She would lose all of it. Camille picked up her phone. She did not call the ethics office first. She called Vivienne. The phone rang twice. Vivienne answered with the voice of a woman who had been awake since 6 and had read 3 front pages and was making tea with steady hands in a stillness that was not the absence of power, but the place where she kept it. "Hun, I found something," Camille said. "I found everything." A pause, brief. The specific pause of a woman processing information in the deep, unhurried place where she kept the things that mattered most. "Are you safe?" Vivienne said. Not, "What did you find?" Not, "Tell me immediately." "Are you safe?" The question of a woman who had learned, at great cost, that people mattered more than information, and that the first obligation of anyone with power was to use it in the direction of the people who were vulnerable. Camille felt something move through her chest at that question, something that had no precise name, but that she recognized as the specific, unfamiliar warmth of being genuinely cared for by someone she had once genuinely wronged. She sat with it for a moment. Then she said, "Not for long, but long enough." "Then go," Vivienne said. "Ready right now. Take everything. Go directly to the ethics office. Do not stop. Do not speak to Gordon or anyone connected to him. I will have my legal team there before you finish filing." Camille stood up. She saved every document to a secure external drive she had been carrying in her bag for 3 days. Because some part of her, the careful, observant part that had always been the most honest thing about her, even when she was using it dishonestly, had understood since the moment she found the first payment record that this moment was coming and had wanted to be ready for it. She picked up her bag. She looked around her reinstated office. The desk, the chair, the window that caught the morning light in a way she had come to depend on, and she understood that she was most likely looking at it for the last time. She walked out anyway. Because the woman she was becoming did not make calculations. She made choices. And this choice, this specific, costly, irrevocable choice, was the one that would define every other choice she made for the rest of her life. She walked to the ethics office with the external drive in her hand and Margaret Hartford's blueprint on it and 15 years of Gordon Hale's maintenance payments beside it and the counselor's card in her bag and Vivienne's legal team already on their way, and she did not look back. But what Camille did not know as she walked into that ethics office, what was happening simultaneously in the kitchen of the home Vivienne and Elliot shared, where the dahlias were blooming and the tea had gone cold again, and Elliot was standing in the doorway with an expression that had no whether she could read, was that the most important conversation of the entire trilogy was about to begin. The conversation about the bus stop, about the file, about the 3 blocks, about everything Elliot had known before the rain-soaked November evening that started everything, and everything he had found instead of what he was looking for. And what Vivienne said in response to that conversation would be the most unthinkable and the most beautiful thing she had ever done. Elliot had been carrying the truth about the bus stop for 2 years, 3 months, and 14 days. He knew the number precisely because he had counted, not obsessively, not with the guilt-driven compulsion of a man who could not stop examining his own wrongdoing, but with the quiet, honest accounting of a man who understood that the length of a secret was part of its weight, and that weight, when you finally set it down, needed to be acknowledged completely. He had rehearsed this conversation more times than he could count, in the shower, in the car, in the boardroom when the meetings ran long, and his mind found the familiar path it always found when his attention was not fully occupied. He had rehearsed it in 100 different versions, gentle versions, direct versions, versions that began with the history and versions that began with the conclusion. But every version had ended the same way, with the same question hanging in the air between the rehearsed Elliot and the imagined Vivienne. And the answer to that question was the thing he had never been able to predict with enough certainty to make the telling feel safe. The question was, will you believe that I love you in spite of how I found you? He came to the kitchen doorway. Vivienne was standing at the counter with her hands flat on the surface, looking at the dahlias. She had read the 3 front pages. She had said Gordon's name with the recognition of a woman who had just understood the full architecture of a betrayal that had been assembled inside her own home. And now she was doing the things she always did in the loudest moments. going quiet inside them, finding the still place, gathering herself with the specific, unhurried confidence of a woman who had learned that stillness was not the absence of strength, but its most reliable expression. She turned when she heard him, and something in his face, something in the combination of the fury and the guilt and the helplessness that had been there since the phone call from his legal team, told her with the precision of a woman who had learned to read him like weather, that what was coming was not about Gordon. "Sit down," she said, not a command, an invitation. The voice of a woman who understood that what was about to be said needed to be said sitting down. Elliot sat. He wrapped both hands around his teacup, cold now, untouched. And he looked at her across the kitchen table with the full, undefended honesty of a man who had run out of versions and was left with only the true one. "My father compiled a file," he began, "before he died." He told her everything. He told it in order, without omission, iterating without the softening qualifications that fear would have introduced into an earlier version of this confession. The file, the names, the photographs, the addresses, the specific, guilt-driven reckoning of a dying man who had understood, too late and too clearly, the full dimensions of what he had taken from the people whose names were in that file. Margaret Hartford at the top, her address below it, the note in his father's handwriting attached to her page. Not the RC annotation that Camille had found in the margin of the blueprint, but a different note, more personal, more broken, written in the shaking hand of a man whose body was already leaving him. She deserved everything. Her daughter deserves what remains. Find a way. Elliot had found a way. The way he had found was the bus stop on Meridian Street, 3 blocks from the address in the file, on a rain-soaked November evening, with a paperback book open in his lap and the deliberate, careful intention of a man who had decided that the most honest thing he could do with his father's guilt was transform it into something that actually helped the person his father had wronged. He had not planned to fall in love with her. He had planned to find her, to observe, to understand who she was before he approached her with the truth about her mother. Because he had understood, with the instinct of a man who had spent years studying people from the quiet distance of deliberate invisibility, that the truth about Margaret Hartford's buried legacy was not something you delivered to a stranger. It needed to be delivered to someone who trusted you, someone who had enough context for the truth to land as restoration rather than devastation. But what happened at the bus stop was not what he had planned. What happened was that she sat down beside him in the rain, with her ruined wedding day still on her skin, and she talked about her mother and dahlias in window boxes and a leather notebook full of things she loved about someone who had already left. And Elliot Crane, who had built towers and acquired land across 4 states and sat in boardrooms where men with expensive watches competed to impress him, felt something he had no framework for and no defense against. He felt found, not the finding he had come to Meridian Street to do, but the finding that happens to people when they encounter someone who makes them understand, without effort and without performance, exactly who they are. He had gone back to the bus stop the next day, and the day after, not to observe, not to plan, but because it was 3 blocks from where she lived, and the possibility that she might be there again was the most compelling thing in his life for reasons that had nothing to do with his father's file, and everything to do with the specific, unprecedented feeling of sitting beside someone in the rain and feeling less alone than he had felt in years. She had not been there the second day, or the third. He had found her differently, through a mutual acquaintance, a connection so indirect and so apparently coincidental that he had understood, sitting across from her at a coffee shop 6 weeks after the bus stop, that the universe was either confirming his intentions or testing them, and that the only honest response to either was to be exactly who he was and let her decide what she wanted to do with that. He had told himself he would tell her about the file before they married, but before they married became after the wedding, and after the wedding became after the boardroom, and after the boardroom became after the shareholder meeting. Each time delayed by the specific compounding fear of a man who had found the most important thing in his life through circumstances he had not been entirely honest about, and who understood, with increasing clarity as the months passed, that the longer he waited, the harder the telling became, and the more the secret had accumulated, the weight of deliberate concealment rather than the weight of imperfect timing. He finished. The kitchen was very quiet. The morning light had moved across the floor and was now reaching the dahlias on the windowsill, catching the deep burgundy of them, making them look like something that had decided to be luminous rather than merely beautiful. Vivienne had not moved while he spoke. She had sat across from him with her hands around her own cold cup and her eyes on his face, and the full, complete attention she gave to everything that mattered. And when he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Long enough for Elliot to understand that the answer was being genuinely considered, not performed, not withheld for effect, but actually and carefully and with full seriousness, turned over in the place where she kept the things that mattered most. Then she said, "You went to that bus stop to make something right." It was not a question. "Yes," Elliot said. And you found something else instead." "Yes." Another silence. Longer. The dahlias caught the light. The kitchen held its breath. "My mother would have liked you," Vivienne said finally, "not because you went to the bus stop, but because when you found something you didn't expect, you stayed for it." She looked at him across the table. The full, clear, undefended look of a woman who had decided. "That is who you are. The bus stop is how you got there, but who you are is why you stayed." Elliot said nothing, but his hands, which had been wrapped tightly around the cold cup since he began speaking, slowly released it. And the breath he drew was the breath of a man setting down something he had been carrying for 2 years, 3 months, and 14 days, and finding in the setting down that the ground beneath him was still there, solid, unchanged, holding him exactly as it always had. But the ground beneath Gordon Hale was not holding. At the precise moment that Elliot and Vivienne sat together in the kitchen, with the dahlias catching the morning light, Camille Rhodes was walking out of the ethics office having filed every document, every payment record, every piece of the GHMH 001 archive. And Vivienne's legal team, who had arrived before she finished, was already in motion. Gordon's legal injunction was challenged within the hour. The coordinated press attack was traced, documented, and submitted to the financial publication's own editorial boards with the evidence of its funding and coordination attached. Alexandra Voss, whose name appeared in the Gordon correspondence with a specificity that left no interpretive room, received a legal notice before noon. Gordon Hale was called into an emergency board meeting at 2 o'clock that afternoon. He arrived with his own legal team, but Vivienne's lawyer was already seated at the head of the table. And beside her, on the screen behind the table, was Margaret Hartford's blueprint, 12 pages, handwritten, dated, signed, annotated, with RC, this is hers, all of it, in the margin of the final page. Gordon looked at the screen for a long moment. Then he looked at the table. Then he looked at the door. But the door had been the wrong thing to look at since the moment Camille walked into the ethics office, and he understood that now with the complete, irreversible clarity of a man whose 15 years of careful maintenance had just been undone by the one person he had never thought to watch. He sat down. And he did not get up again under his own authority, but the most devastating and the most beautiful moment of the entire trilogy had not yet arrived. It was waiting in the final scene, in a kitchen, with dahlias on the windowsill, and a leather notebook on the table, and a second sealed document that contained, on its very last page, something that Vivienne had not known existed, and that would break her open and put her back together in the same breath. Something in her mother's own handwriting, written not for lawyers or partners or founding charters, but for Vivienne. Only for Vivienne. A letter that Margaret Hartford had placed inside the blueprint 30 years ago, knowing that if the truth ever surfaced, her daughter would eventually find her way to it. And what that letter said was the most unthinkable and the most beautiful thing this entire story had been building toward since the first cream rose fell on the church steps. The letter was the last thing in the file. Vivienne found it 3 days after the board meeting, 3 days after Gordon Hale's removal, 3 days after Alexandra Voss's professional reputation collapsed under the weight of the correspondence that bore her name. 3 days after the legal injunction was lifted and the financial publications ran corrections that occupied the same front pages that had carried her face above words designed to unmake her. 3 days after the world had righted itself in the thunderous, public, vindicating way that Vivienne had never asked for and had not allowed herself to anticipate, because she had learned, Sonny, in the years since the church, that the surest way to lose your footing was to spend your energy watching for the moment the ground leveled, rather than tending the things that mattered while it was still uneven. She had been going through the GH-MH-001 file with her legal team when they found it, tucked behind the blueprint, behind the founding documents, behind 30 years of carefully maintained burial. A single envelope, sealed, with one word written on the front, in the handwriting Vivienne would have recognized anywhere, in any context, on any surface, because it was the handwriting that had signed permission slips and birthday cards and the notes her mother had left on the kitchen counter on the morning she left for work before Vivienne woke up. Vivienne, her legal team understood without being told. They left the room quietly, kept with the professional discretion of people who recognize the difference between a legal document and a private one. And Vivienne sat alone at the conference table with the envelope in her hands and the blueprint on the screen behind her, and the morning light coming through the windows of the 14th floor of Weston Crane Real Estate. The building her mother had designed, the empire her mother's genius had made possible, the company whose nameplate read E. Crane, principal owner, and would soon, pending the final legal transfer, read something that included a second name. And she held the envelope for a long time before she opened it. She opened it the way she did everything that mattered, slowly, without performance, with the full, unhurried attention of a woman who understood that some moments deserved to be entered carefully because you could not go back through them once you had passed. The letter was 4 pages, written in her mother's hand, the same hand that had written the blueprint, the same hand that had annotated 12 pages of founding vision, with the clear, deliberate notations of a woman who understood exactly what she was creating. But softer here, more personal, the handwriting of a woman writing not for the record, but for her daughter. My darling Vivienne, if you are reading this, then the truth has finally found its way to you. I always knew it would. The truth is patient in ways that people are not. It does not tire, it does not forget, and it does not require your permission to surface. It simply waits until the right person is ready to receive it. I want to tell you about the blueprint, not the legal version. Your lawyers will handle that, and I trust that by the time this letter reaches you, the right people will have made sure that what was mine has been returned to what is yours. I want to tell you about the morning I walked into that room with it. I was 31 years old. Your father was sick. You were 4, and you had just learned to say the word Dahlia, and you said it every morning, pointing at the window box like you were reminding me that beauty was worth tending, even when everything else was hard. I walked into that room with my blueprint and 2 men who I believed were partners, and I placed everything I had built on the table between us. I knew within the first 10 minutes, what they intended to do with it. I am not telling you this to make them villains. Robert Crane was a complicated man who did a wrong thing for reasons that were not entirely simple. And the wrong he did to me, he spent the rest of his life, I believe, trying to find a way to undo. I am telling you this because I want you to understand what I chose and why. I chose to let them have it, not because I was weak, not because I did not understand what I was giving up, but because I looked at those 2 men and I looked at your father waiting for me at home, and I looked at you, 4 years old, learning to say Dahlia, pointing at the window box every morning, and I made a calculation that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with love. The fight to reclaim what they had taken would have been long and costly and consuming. It would have taken years. It would have taken me away from your father in the time he had left. It would have taken me away from you. You were worth more than the blueprint. You were worth more than the empire. You were worth more than every floor of every building they would ever raise on the foundation of what I brought to that table. And I have never, not for a single morning since, regretted the choice I made. Because the life I chose instead, the dahlias, the window box, the permission slips, the 4-hour drives and snowstorms to sit beside the people I loved at their most important moments. That life was not the consolation prize. That life was the point. But I also knew that the truth would surface. And I knew it the way you know things that are simply true, not with evidence, not with logic, but with the bone-deep certainty of a woman who understood that buried things do not stay buried. They wait, they accumulate, and when they surface for the person they were always meant to reach. They were always meant to reach you, my darling. I placed this letter in the blueprint because I knew that whoever found the blueprint would eventually find their way to you. I did not know how. I did not know when. I did not know that it would take 30 years, or that it would involve a church and a bus stop, and a man in a wheelchair, and a company that would one day bear your name alongside his. I did not know any of the specific, extraordinary shape that your life would take. But I knew you. I knew what you were made of. And I knew that whatever came at you, you would meet it with a specific, unhurried, load-bearing strength that you have had since you were 4 years old, pointing at the window box and reminding me every single morning that beauty was worth tending even when everything else was hard. The company is yours, not because I gave it to you, but because it was always built on what was mine, and what was mine was always going to become yours, the same way the dahlias were always going to become yours, and the leather notebook, and the ability to be still in the loudest moments, and the knowledge that grace given freely is never wasted even when it appears to fall on ground that cannot receive it. Tend the dahlias, my darling. Tend the people who deserve your tending, and never, not for a single morning, mistake your stillness for smallness. All of it was always yours, all my love. And always, Mama Vivienne sat with the letter for a long time, long enough for the morning light to move completely across the conference room floor, long enough for the city outside the 14th floor windows to go through the full, ordinary, indifferent business of being a city, long enough for the full weight of what she had just received, not the equity, not the legal restoration, not the public vindication, but this, 4 pages in her mother's handwriting, the most important thing Margaret Hartford had ever built, to settle into its proper and permanent place inside her. Then she folded the letter carefully. She placed it in the 4th leather notebook. Not at the end, in the middle where it belonged, in the center of the ongoing record of a life that was still being written and had more pages left than it had used. She called Elliot. He answered on the first ring. "Come to the 14th floor," she said. "Bring tea." He came. He brought tea. And they sat together at the conference room table with the blueprint on the screen and the letter in the notebook and the dahlias. She had brought one from the windowsill that morning, a single deep burgundy stem in a small glass, between them. And Vivienne read the letter to Elliot the way her mother had written it, slowly, completely, without omission, with the full, unhurried attention that some things deserved. When she finished, Elliot was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "She knew. She always knew," Vivienne said, "about the blueprint, about the burial, about all of it." Vivienne looked at the dahlia and the glass between them. "And she chose us anyway. She chose the window box and the permission slips and the 4-hour drives. She chose the life that was small enough to be present in." She looked at Elliot. "That is not a woman who lost. That is a woman who knew exactly what she was doing and did it completely." Elliot looked at her across the table, the full, unhurried, specific look of a man who had gone to a bus stop to make something right and found instead the most important thing that had ever happened to him, and he said nothing, because nothing was necessary, because they were, in this moment, in complete and permanent agreement about the thing that mattered most. Margaret Hartford had not been buried. She had been planting, and everything she had planted, the dahlias, the blueprint, the letter, the daughter, had bloomed exactly as she intended. 6 weeks later, after the legal transfer was completed, the company nameplate on the 14th floor was updated. It read, from that morning forward, E. Crane and V. Hartford Crane, principal owners. Camille Rhodes was promoted that same morning by Vivienne in the boardroom in front of the full leadership team to Director of Corporate Ethics and Compliance. She accepted with the steady, unperformed dignity of a woman who had earned the title not through calculation, but through the single most costly and most defining choice of her life. She kept the counselor's card in her desk drawer. She kept Elliot's handwritten note beside it. And she added that evening a third item, a photograph of a dahlia, deep burgundy, that Vivienne had left on her desk without a note. Because some things did not need words. Trillionaire, because some things were simply understood between women who had been through the fire together and come out the other side of it holding something neither of them had gone in with. Derek Weston completed his first year of Thursday evening accountability meetings and began, quietly and without announcement, mentoring young men at a community center near his apartment. Men who were in the early stages of becoming the worst version of themselves and who needed someone who had been there and come back to tell them, honestly and without the performance of a redemption arc, what the journey actually looked like from the inside. He was not transformed. He was transforming, which was, his Thursday group had taught him, the only honest version of change that existed. Alexandra Voss relocated. Not dramatically, not with the sweeping exit of a woman who intended to return. Simply and permanently, the way people relocate when the city they are leaving has nothing left in it that belongs to them. And Gordon Hale, who had spent 15 years maintaining the burial of a woman's genius and had detonated every weapon available to him in the attempt to keep it buried, faced the full legal consequences of 15 years of fraudulent stake maintenance, coordinated press manipulation, and obstruction of rightful equity transfer. His fraudulent stake was dissolved. His assets were frozen pending investigation, and the office on the 14th floor that had been his for 15 years was reassigned on Vivienne's instruction to the newly created Margaret Hartford Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to identifying, funding, and legally protecting the intellectual contributions of women in business whose work had been buried, overlooked, or appropriated without credit or compensation. The foundation's inaugural grant was awarded on a Tuesday morning in early spring. Vivienne announced it from the 14th floor in the boardroom where a nameplate had once read, E. Crane, principal owner, and where the floor had once fallen away beneath the people who had built their lives on her wreckage. She spoke without notes. She spoke about her mother, about dahlias in window boxes and permission slips and 4-hour drives in snowstorms, and the specific, extraordinary courage of a woman who had walked into a room with her genius in her hands and chosen, with full understanding of what she was giving up, to give it up for love. She spoke about what it meant to tend something, to stay with it, to believe in the face of every reasonable argument for bitterness, that the buried things would surface, and that when they did, they would be worth the waiting. She spoke about grace, not as a feeling, but as a practice. Not as the absence of anger, but as the deliberate daily choice to become someone that anger could not permanently occupy. She spoke about the counselor's card and what it meant to extend restoration to someone who had not earned it and might not be able to receive it, and how that extension, given freely and without conditions, had become the instrument of its own vindication in ways she could not have designed if she had tried. And then she stopped speaking, because the room was full of people who had heard enough words and needed now, in the specific and irreplaceable testimony of a life that had been lived in accordance with everything she had just said. She went home to the dahlias, to the leather notebook, the 5th one now, the 4th having been filled on a Tuesday morning 6 weeks earlier, with a letter from her mother and the words that came after it, slowly and without agenda, in Vivienne's own hand. To Elliot in the doorway, with 2 cups of tea and the expressions she could read like weather, and that said this morning as it said every morning, the same simple and complete and entirely sufficient thing. We are okay. They were more than okay. They were the proof, the living, specific, unhurried, unperformed proof, that the buried things do not stay buried, that the people who underestimate you are, without knowing it, your architects. That betrayal is not the end of the story. That grace is not weakness. That stillness is not smallness. That the most extraordinary lives are not the ones that avoided the storm. They are the ones that were built, carefully and honestly and with great love, from everything the storm left behind. And in a window box on the sill of a house that had been assembled from the wreckage of a church altar and a rain-soaked bus stop and a counselor's card and a sealed document and a mother's 30-year-old letter, the dahlias bloomed, deep burgundy, the color of something that had decided a long time ago and without apology to be beautiful despite everything, which was, as Margaret Hartford had always known, the whole point. What Vivienne Hartford taught us across 3 parts and 300 moments of Grace Under Fire is this: Your life is not determined by what is done to you. It is determined by what you choose to tend in the aftermath. The church did not define her. The boardroom did not define her. The press storm and the legal injunction and the dinner table betrayal and the bus stop secret did not define her. What defined her was the daily unglamorous, unwitnessed choice to remain faithful to herself, to her healing, to the people who were genuinely trying, and to the quiet, radical belief that buried things surface, that truth is patient, and that the life built carefully from wreckage is always, always stronger at the broken places than it ever was before. And Margaret Hartford, the woman who walked into a room with her genius and chose love over empire, was not the tragedy of this story. She was its architect. She planted everything. She knew exactly what she was doing, and she was right. Dear viewers, tell me, what did Margaret's letter teach you that you needed to hear today? And if you have been tending something quietly, in the unglamorous and unwitnessed way that real tending always happens, tell me about it, because your story matters, and you deserve to know that. Subscribe now. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And remember, the best story is always the next one, but it is also always the one you are living right now.